We are live. This is the Senate Education Committee, 3:15 or almost 3:20 in the afternoon on 21st of January. We just completed a 2-hour joint meeting with the House Ed Committee and the House Commerce Committee, all kind of in preparation for the funding that bill that we'll be working on in the out weeks. But today, we're taking some time to get a little bit of an introduction to the State Board of Education and what their role is versus the role of the Secretary of Education, et cetera, just to get this committee ready to think about how all of this fits in when we're working on a bigger proposal later on for sure. So you might want to, as we start, we're going around the room and doing the introduction. Actually, we can start with Will. Go ahead. Will's our committee assistant. That's
Hello. I'm Will, the committee assistant. We've been emailing.
Senator Terry Williams, Rutland District.
Senator Heffernan, Addison County District.
Nader Hashim, Wyndham County.
Dave Weeks, Rutland County.
Seth Barnes, Bennington Senate District. When I say Bennington Senate District, because I have a couple of towns that are not in Bennington County. So let's go to Bennington Senate District. And then,
All right.
so now you are on, introduce yourselves and take
Nice
it away.
to see you all again and nice to meet you. I'm Jennifer Deck Samuelson. I'm the chair of the Vermont State Board of Education. I'm joined by Tammy Colby, who is the vice chair of the State Board of Ed. Thank you all very much for having us here today. This is a similar presentation that I've done for the last couple of years, but every year when I come back to it, I find ways to make it more responsive, I hope, and more relevant. So this will be a good refresher for some of you, but like a good foundational overview, I hope. And this is the same presentation that Tammy and I will be giving tomorrow to House Ed in the morning. So just briefly, State Board membership is set by 16 DSA Section 161. We have 11 total members. We have 8 non-student members, adults, where the preference is given to people with a demonstrated commitment to ensuring quality education for Vermont students. I know the governor has tried to have some geographic diversity and different perspectives on the board, which I will get to in a moment. Board members typically serve 6 years, although if you come into someone else's term, you can actually do 6 years on top of that. We also have 2 student members. The first year is non-voting. The second year, the student is a full voting member of the board. And then we have the Secretary of Education who serves as a non-voting member. All members are appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. And then this slide just goes through briefly the State Board membership. So these are the 11 members who are currently on the State Board of Education. I put down our town of residence as well as things that we bring to the position. In terms of, we've got school board members. Dr. Colby was a professor at UVM. She's now a principal researcher at AIR. So we've got some pretty good representation, former principals, former heads of school on the board. Then I wanted to kind of step back, and I know that Secretary Saunders touched on this a little bit, but prior to 2012, there was a different structure and a different relationship between the board and what was then the Department of Education. So prior to 2012, the State Board of Ed selected the Commissioner of Education. We directed the work of the Department of Education. We directed policy and technical direction of the department, and we supervised the Commissioner. That all changed in a pretty fundamental way with Act 98 of 2012. That was the act that established the Agency of Education and elevated the commissioner to a secretary who reports directly to the governor. So as many of you may recall, last year, the State Board of Ed is still charged in statute with conducting the search for a secretary. We proposed 3 candidates to the governor, and then the governor made the ultimate decision. But we do not have oversight over the secretary or the agency. But you'll still see in statute that we're still pretty fairly intertwined with the agency. At this point, post 2012, we do serve a rather unique position in that we are independent, we're neutral. All of our meetings are warned.
You skipped over the last couple just to make sure we touch on this. The part about still retaining oversight.
I'm sorry, which page is it?
maybe the second or third page of this one. You didn't mention the Act 98, the first.
Oh, I thought I did. I'm sorry.
Did you, maybe, did you say it? Okay,
I thought so.
okay. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So Act 98 of 2012 established the Agency of Education and then elevated the commissioner to a secretary who reports directly to the governor. And the key point of this slide is that we do not have oversight over the secretary or the agency.
Okay, I was referring to the last two bullets.
Okay. Okay, we still retain oversight with respect to rulemaking. I do know that the district quality standards were given to the Agency of Education by the legislature. That is the only rulemaking that the agency has undertaken. Everything else, it still remains with the State Board of Education. But the agency is responsible for implementing the rules and regulations that have been adopted by the State Board. So we have tried, and we can, I mean, I think EQS is a really good example of that, of really trying to have good partnership with the agency as we go through the rulemaking process, because we're setting the rules, but the agency is implementing them, and we want to make sure that you know, what we're proposing is actually implementable.
So does that mean that the AOE does not have rulemaking authority? Or
Correct.
Okay.
At this,
Unless it's explicitly given that authority in statute.
Okay.
So what happened under Act 127, there was a provision within that act that provided for the agency to create the district quality standards. That's the only instance in sort of near memory where that's occurred, right? So if the legislature decides, yes, then they can have rulemaking authority over certain things. But we can talk about sort of what that looks like and sort of what opportunities and challenges that kind of approach might bring.
thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, it's okay. So State Board still has real rule here going on.
Yes. So as it stands now, post 2012, we are an independent board of citizens. We are a public forum, so all of our meetings are warned and open to the public. We are neutral, so we act consistent with legislative intent, and we advise the General Assembly when asked. We also serve a quasi-judicial role. This was more relevant when I first came on the board, where we did have rate appeals by therapeutic schools, and we also had some tuition appeals. Frankly, I don't think we've had any of those for a couple of years, but it's still, you know, a possibility. We also have authority under 16 VSA section 261 for the organization and adjustment of supervisory unions and supervisory districts. And we still retain the authority to engage in rulemaking pursuant to 16 VSA section 164(7). So how do we determine our work? It basically falls into three buckets. One, you know, anything that's set in statute, and there are many things that are still in statute that have survived, you know, the split with the Agency of Education. It's still on the books. So for instance, 16 VSA section 164 has, I want to say, 21 subparagraphs of responsibilities that have been given to the State Board of Ed. 16 VSA 165 sets forth the education quality standards and, you know, gives us that authority to set those up. We also get our work through legislative acts. So for instance, Act 46 and Act 173, those had very specific provisions in them that directed the board to engage and work in furtherance of those acts. And then of course we have all of our rules. So I'll get to the rules in a few more slides. Then when we execute our work, it is listed in statute that we are supposed to be supported by adequate staff. I will say we are heavily reliant upon the Agency of Education for supporting our meetings in terms of warning them, you know, posting the agenda packets, maintaining our website, taking our minutes for us. So Maureen and Suzanne of the agency have been fantastic, supporting the board and supporting all of our meetings. But beyond that, we don't really have a whole lot of support. We in the past have relied on agency counsel, and really, I mean, I think the best thing to say is that muddies the waters too much, and so we do not rely on agency counsel because we are a different organizational entity. So We have our meetings typically the third Wednesday of the month. Since the pandemic, we've kind of done a hybrid of trying to be in person in the spring and again in the fall, and then leaving the winter months remote. And we've found, with the pandemic, that it's actually easier for people to attend our meetings if they're remote, because they don't have to drive. They can just, much like here, they can log on, log off. So we're trying to strike a balance with that. And then we tweak the times of our meetings depending on if we're in person or remote. If we're remote, we start at 8:30. The in-person meetings tend to be, we start later, we tend to tour the school, and we often hold in-person meetings to celebrate, if we've got board members who are going off the board.
So, Jen, can you talk a little bit more about staffing? You did it quickly. You really don't have staff?
We do not have staff.
And to the extent you're supported, where does that come from?
That comes from the agency, so Maureen Davis and Suzanne Sprague at the agency will, they actually think now they both support our meetings, because all of our meetings are on the Teams platform. For a while they had not been, and I think one of them was able to sort of manage the meeting, but since we're on the Teams platform, it requires both of them to run the meetings.
One typically is managing the Teams platform, while the other one is helping us take minutes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's kind of, though, helping like Will's doing today,
Yes.
helping,
Yeah.
and then,
Yeah.
and then helping with minutes.
Yes,
And that's.
That's it.
That's
that is
Just want to make sure, okay, yes, Senator.
Thanks, sir. So you brought up the issue of legal counsel. So where do you get your legal counsel now?
we have to put it out to bid. So, and we found that was really important with rulemaking, both with EQS and with 2200. Very important to have rulemaking, having the assistance of counsel to help us with that. It's not cheap. It is also, it takes time to go through the contract when we put it out to bid, go through the contract. From the time we articulate a need for legal counsel, it takes about 3 months to actually get legal counsel in place. And then, of course, counsel is sort of constrained by the terms of the underlying contract. So if something else comes up and we need legal counsel, the person with whom we have a contract is not able to help us unless that question is somehow encompassed by the terms of the contract. Which you could imagine, there are times that questions arise and we find ourselves without legal guidance, which is challenging.
And, how does your budget work?
We are a line item in the agency's budget. And that has been level funded, I believe, since 2021. It's just over $70,000 a year, but that $70,000 a year pays for, our per diems, it pays for travel, it pays for advertising expenses, reporting expenses. $70,000 is it. It's
Not a lot.
not a lot.
So nobody's full-time at all?
No, I think it's helpful to think of us as volunteers.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last point on this slide is that in addition to our monthly meetings, we will hold special meetings as required for the performance of our duties. So in a given year, we typically have 2 to 4 special meetings as necessary. Our organization, biennially by statute, the board selects its chair, so we will be doing that this March. And then this is not in statute, but historically we also select a vice chair, which has been very helpful to help share the work. And then we also decided, really under Oliver Olson, to break up our work into committee structure, because it just allows the meetings of the full board to be run more efficiently. It allows us to get more work done. And then the committees bring their recommendations to the full board for a discussion and vote. So this goes through, this is just a general overview of board activities in 2024. I did this last year as well. We had, I think, over 60 meetings in 2023. Last year we had just over 40. And then this breaks down the type of committee, the number of meetings that we had per year that were in 2024, as well as the board members who are on each of those committees. So you can see that most board members are on more than one committee. So we're pretty busy. And then just because I didn't spell out EQS, SPS, The EQS committee had been the committee that was in charge with the rulemaking updates to the education quality standards. But once that committee's function had been executed, because we passed the rules and they were approved by LCAR, that same committee, the same people are now, it's now called the Student Performance Standards Committee, because now what they're looking at are the student performance standards that arise pursuant to 16 VSA 164-9 and how those fit into the education quality standards.
May I add something? So I think an important distinction to make here is that the board has rulemaking authority, right? So we're a regulatory body in that respect. But under the 16 VSA 164, we are also charged with approving the curricular standards, right, for the state. And so that's not rule, that's something different. And so this standards committee, we have in the most recent past 3 different sets of curricular standards that we had to approve, one for health and PE, and now we're looking at the IRIS framework, which is the social equity standards that would be sort of paired up with the recent revisions of the EQS. I think it's important to realize that we have rulemaking that we do. We have a canon of rules. We also have standards that we have to sort of approve and consider and things along those lines. Those are 2 different things that we have to do.
So this next slide just briefly overviews the work that was completed in 2024. And this was also noted in the report that the board submitted to the General Assembly, which hopefully you guys have all gotten a copy of. But the big highlights here are that we completed updates to the education quality standards. Those were voluminous. I think you guys had, I forget how many meetings, I think it's in your presentation, many meetings to get those opened up and, you know, really where the board wanted them to go. So those rules will go into effect on July 1st, 2025, this year. We also—
So the number is 42 meetings and 3 public hearings over 18 months.
We also completed a second round of updates to World Series 2200, which are the independent school approvals. So those updates in the second round had a few different purposes. One was to apply the principles and rules of Act 1 to independent schools and to adopt the same substantive language that had been introduced in World Series 2000. We also introduced the requirement that independent schools, as a condition of their continued approval, must complete and submit annual assurances of their compliance with the rules. So that is now taking effect. The agency has sent out those requests. We also provided a comprehensive framework of requirements that accrediting agencies must meet in order to be recognized by the board. It used to be there was Rule 7320 that listed out specific agencies by name. And what the board found was that that list was really outdated, and we decided rather than listing by name and then having to engage in rulemaking to update the list, what was more important was to create a framework where this is what we want an accrediting agency to be able to demonstrate to the board. So that's the framework. And then now, as agencies come before the board, and there have been 3 that the board has recognized to date, those are noted on the board's website. So it's a little bit more nimble. We also now require a method by which the agency will evaluate whether a school is compliant with the non-discrimination requirements. And so this is a really good example of the board engaged in rulemaking, but the agency is in charge of, you know, really carrying out what's in rule. We also clarified the process by which accredited and non-accredited schools may apply for and receive approval and reapproval, keeping in mind that there is a moratorium on new approvals of independent schools, so we're only looking at reapprovals at this point. And most of those rules went into effect this past July. There are a couple of subsections, the instructional strategies and curriculum content, that will take effect on July 1st of this year. And then we also do the independent school approvals and reapprovals. And in the past year, we approved 2 post-secondary schools and again, recognized 3 accrediting agencies. So to the question of current issues facing the State Board of Education, as I mentioned, our budget is just over $70,000. We have been level funded since 2021. And 2021 was a pretty significant decrease from prior years. As we all know, inflation has gone up. So obviously the money that we have has not kept pace. It's enough for the board to kind of do baseline work. It is not enough for the board to do more.
I don't think I've heard of a single entity in state government that has a budget of $70,000
With 11
for
people on
office
it.
supplies. Yeah, that's
And
amazing,
a
impressive,
And
and
we're
scary.
responsible for the canon of rules. that
Yes.
govern public,
Yeah.
private, and
Yeah.
independent
Like
schools.
less than $100,000 for anything in state government is like
so, yes.
worthy of museum.
And by statute, we earn so Tammy and I are earning $6.25 to be with you here this afternoon. Thank you. For $50 a meeting. And as I mentioned earlier, we have no dedicated legal support. So as a result, as the Student Performance Standards Committee is looking at this IRIS framework, we do not have funds remaining in our budget to hire a consultant to assist us. We do not have funds remaining in our budget to hire an attorney to help us with updates to the career and technical education rules. We have put this out to bid. We have an attorney. We actually can't execute the contract because we do not have money. I think we have maybe $35,000 left in our budget to get us through June 30th. And along with that, we don't have funds to fully discharge our statutory obligations. So I would say the state board has been very busy, and I'm really proud of the work that we're doing. And I think we're doing, really helping to shape the educational landscape in Vermont. But the way we are structured, I can feel really good about the work that I'm doing, but I can also feel really bad about the work that we're not doing. But there's not the funding, there's not the time for it.
And a little dangerous to be acting without the advice of counsel. I'm not sure doing something like you're doing, but.
Yeah. And so far, I just want to reassure you that, so far, we have had legal counsel assisting us. Right now, we do not have any legal counsel under contract. So yes, to your point, that could be a challenge, but.
And I think it also speaks to the fact, and I think you're going to highlight this in a moment, we have undertaken some substantial rule updates, the EQS, the independent school rules. We're about to embark on the CTE's rules in order to make sure that these three key pieces of regulation are aligned with one another. So we have a common set of educational experiences for students across all platforms in the state. But we got a lot of rules, and some of them are 25 years out of date now. And one of the priorities I think we've really talked about is, and this is a priority in the field, because the rules, the regulations are the things that school boards look to for guidance, that principals look to, teachers look for how to do their work. And when we have rules that are significantly out of date, such as graduation requirements, adult-based education, literacy standards that are no longer congruent with statute, right? They're no longer congruent with governance structures. It's a real problem in the field. And one of the things that we've talked about and we are very interested in doing is moving forward on updating that canon of rules and bringing them current. But resources dictate our ability to do so, and that is not something I think anybody on the board is comfortable doing without having independent legal counsel.
So when you are doing the rulemaking, like for 2000, you tend to get draft rules from the agency, and then you work from.
We did not,
It depends.
well, let me back up. So 2200, we had the phase one updates that went into effect in 2022. And then part of them went into effect in 2022, and then the rest went into effect in 2023. So phase one updates, we did have the assistance of the Agency of Education with that set of rule updates. Then moving on to the phase two updates, which are the ones that we just completed last year, we retained outside counsel to assist us, as well as outside counsel to assist us with EQS. What we're proposing, or what we've discussed with the agency with regard to CTE, is that their counsel will do the first pass at it and then hand it to the board, and then the board will sort of take on the formal rulemaking process and have the public comment hearings. So a little bit more of a hybrid.
And in the case of the EQS, we had the ACORN working group that brought a set of recommendations to us for how to revise that rule that we then spent a lot of time processing, both in sort of taking in public comment, receiving legal counsel, advice from legal counsel on how to implement those things, and also to standardize those recommendations across both the rule series that apply to independent schools and public schools. So the changes can come to us in different ways, right? We've taken them in from a commission, for CTE, I think where you've got a partnership where we're gonna first take some in from, some initial drafts come in from the agency. And we also open them up ourselves, right? And start that way. It depends on sort of where we are in the role, what the role is, what the technical expertise of the board is, and what the updates need to be. But with something as substantial as updating the EQS or the CTE rules, we need outside input on that.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions. One, what would you like your budget to be? And then two, when you open it up to public comment, do you get a lot of, you do?
We had
Do you
over
have a
100.
statistics?
Yeah,
okay.
for the EQS, we had to have over 100 comments, and we had 3 public hearings, but we also had, as I said, 42 subcommittee meetings. And at those 42 subcommittees, we had the opportunity for public comment at both the beginning and the end, in addition to reaching out to constituencies around the state. So I like to think that we are the public in public education, right? We are how the public accesses sort of the rules and the rulemaking process and provides an important input. And I can talk about this in the context of the EQS. That public comment and that public input was really important in terms of how that final rule shaped up. As for the budget,
We do have an updated budget, so.
we have a budget request.
Correct, yeah. So we're thinking about it sort of in 3 tiers. One is, we are currently in FY '25. As I mentioned, we don't have money to hire a consultant to help us with the Student Performance Standards Committee. We do not have money to hire an attorney to help us with updates to the career technical education rules. The attorney that we used for the last round of updates to 2200 and EQS, ballpark is about $50,000, 50 to 60 to engage in that level of rulemaking. And those are pretty meaty rules. There are certainly other rules that are not nearly so substantive that, would not require that same amount. But our request is, $25,000 in this current fiscal year to get us started, and then $25,000 in FY '26 to help us conclude that work, because I'm assuming we have not gotten a draft from the agency, with 8 months with the formal rulemaking process. This will span 2 fiscal years. So to your question, we would love to have line item adjustments to help us kind of get through the current fiscal year. And then we would really love to have a conversation about what we would like to do for FY '26. And I think honestly, that includes having an attorney on retainer, so that when questions arise, it literally is as easy as picking up the phone. We would love to have more money to enable us to do more work. As Tammy mentioned, many of our rules are over 20 years old. Anytime I see a rule that refers to the commissioner, I know that rule really needs to be updated. And we can open up any rule series on our own authority. It's just a question of, do we have the resources to do it? And currently we don't.
And our budget request sort of bifurcates this in terms of sort of these operating dollars that we would need to sort of move things through this year, but also a one-time chunk of money, right? That would allow us to have counsel and have the time and space we need to take a holistic look at the rules, right? I'm not convinced we need all the rules anymore, right? Like we need to sort of stand back and look and say, well, okay, what do we need? How do we update it in a thoughtful way, right? To make sure that it reflects what's in statute, but also sort of current operating principles with respect to the relationship between the agency and the state board, and also current operating principles that are in the field, right? So that's a bigger effort, but I think we can think about that as a one-time allocation that would be spent down over several years. I think that's probably a 24-month process.
So don't we have a BAA coming up?
Yes.
So, as far as retaining an attorney, you got one, you just don't have the money to fund it.
Correct, for rulemaking, but I
Right.
think, I would love to have an attorney for, 2 distinct purposes. One is to help us with rulemaking, and one to be general counsel to the board. And that can be the same person, but I think it needs to be two different buckets.
You'd almost think that AOE would wanna have the general counsel involved in this process, because you're all
Well-
working lockstep.
I think that's a really good perspective, but I think the challenge is that we're two separate entities and we need our own counsel, because at times we have standing in a matter that we need to sort of advocate or defend ourselves against that may or may not be different than the standing that the agency holds in a matter. And it gets really murky between the two. And so we do, however, rely heavily on agency counsel as a collaborator in lots of ways, and they are always willing to help, and the agency's counsel is exceptional, so.
Secretary Saunders is on the board as a non-voting member, so
Correct.
you have her ear or designee.
That's right,
Yeah.
that's right.
And she attends almost every meeting, and sometimes she's conflicted, so she will, come in when she can, but, step out when she
Yeah.
must. But she has been very good about, and all of the secretaries with whom we've worked since I've been on the board have been very good about, being at our meetings.
But as we'll talk about with the EQS and some of the things that are coming down the road, right? There are some potentially challenging legal situations that we're going to have to contend with, and the state board is going to have its own role in that and have its own standing in those discussions, and that is independent of the agency.
Let me just get clear about what you're looking for. For, the BAA, you're looking for $65,000.
Yes. If there were more money to put an attorney on retainer, I would bump that up
That would
to,
be okay as well.
yeah, and I would say the estimate there is about $36,000 a year, so for the second half of FY '25, $18,000.
Okay, so.
If you were able to put $100,000 in the BAA.
I was like, that's almost too small of a number.
No,
you know?
I
Just go round it up.
I used to work for fiscal staff in the legislature. If you could put $100,000 in the BAA, that would certainly address the concerns that we have
For FY '25.
for FY '25. And we would appreciate
And
some
then-
additional discussion around one-time money for the rulemaking.
And then just to make sure we understand what you're asking for 26.
So
You're
26,
looking for,
we would, want the second half of, so as I mentioned, $50,000 to engage in the CTE updates. So we're asking for 25,000 in FY '25. That's part of the 100,000 stuff that you just
Yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah.
So the remaining 25 would go into FY '26. So that's 25,000, $36,000 for, council on retainer. And then the rule updates, so we have received I would call it a, for instance, proposal, from an attorney as a particular, a sample approach as to how to chunk out, the number of rules that need to be updated. And it would be over, 3 to 5 years to get all of that work done. I did not submit that because we're not under contract with this attorney, and I don't want to sort of elevate that and have, you guys look at, but we could propose something to you.
so you also have at the top of this number, you have your 70,000 that you have
Yes.
now. Is your
Yeah.
base. So you have 70, just to really make sure I understand it, you have looking for your current 70 plus 25 plus 36 plus,
18. Oh, wait.
No, plus 26.
Okay, we're on it, yeah, sorry.
and then, I'm sorry, 36. And then some portion of the money you would be looking for to hire an attorney to help with the next round.
I think it would be fair to say $100,000 a year for rulemaking over,
I think it's fair to say if we were to have a budget of approximately $200,000 a year, that would be sufficient to take care of sort of the corpus of work that we've talked about. To Chair Samuelson's point, we do have a number that we would like to propose that would be a one-time number that is attached to the revisions of the rules that would be spent down over multiple years.
Good.
I don't know what my face is doing, but I'm having so much trouble putting this in context because that is so little money if we believe what you do is critical to, the value that education and statewide curriculum, education is very new for me. It's like the one subject in my 12 years I hadn't tried to delve into because it's so complicated, but I'm having a really hard time understanding that this is the situation, like in the big picture. I mean, how much does AOE have? Is this all general fund dollars? What is happening? Like,
So
how
the
do we have
challenge
so
has
little
been
money?
is that the challenge has been is that after before 2012,
Mhm.
right, state board was part of the agency's budget,
Mhm.
right? So we propose our budgets back to the agency, and to Chair Samuelson's point, our budget was cut fairly significantly in 2021. And so,
What was that cut? What was it? What
I want to say, I think it was 80,000
It
a
was
year.
almost-
Okay.
Oh, was it more?
yeah, it was pretty substantial. Half.
Okay.
Right, and so, to your point, however, I'm gonna go back to the fact that the rules haven't been updated in 20 years, right? And so, one of the things that Jennifer and I have been talking a lot about is, this is a core set of our responsibilities, right? And part of the reason that this core responsibility hasn't been taken on is lack of resources, right? And so, we have identified this as a strategic priority for the board, and it's going to take some resources to move that forward. And I think you've already heard from Chair Samuelson, we're doing very important work. We work very hard as a board. We have an extremely talented group of people on the board who work very long hours to make sure things happen. But if resources are a metric of sort of our worth and what gets done, that's a really bad metric. Because we don't have any.
Yeah. Can I ask one more question? Have you, I mean, I don't want to ask you to do any more work. I might ask the agency to do this, but I can't imagine there's another state board of education in the country that has like less than a 6-figure budget. I don't know, like.
Well, I think the other important thing to remember is that we all have jobs.
Yeah.
Other than, and, you know, I often find that ironically, the state board ends up being the fire that's burning brightest because there are statutory deadlines that have to be met. And so I have a job, I have clients, and those clients often, you know, sort of get my attention at, 10 o'clock at night. So it is a lot of work. And I guess the other thing, and maybe this is a philosophical conversation for another day, but as you think about the composition of the state board, and when you think about, how the state board is funded and how members are compensated, it takes a certain person to be able to do this work. And I would encourage the legislature to really think about, to the extent that you want to broaden the base of people who might be able to do this work. And I think there are plenty of people out there that would be very willing and able and qualified to do this work, but don't have that flexibility to be able to, do it on $6.25 an hour.
Yeah.
So.
You've been waiting, several weeks.
Well, that being said, if you never ask for it, you don't get it. So what do you feel or believe, I hate the word feel, believe your time's worth? You should propose that to us as well.
We can follow up with an email to the committee that provides some more specifics.
Because if you don't ask, it's kind of like
I know that
us
has been some comparisons to what sort of other board members, for example, on healthcare boards and things along those lines that operate the state are compensated very differently.
Well, and if I may, I'm also sensitive to the fact that, there are many different, levels of interest, vying for a very small pot of money. So I'm trying to be very pragmatic about what the board is asking for. So it's a little bit, I can sort of complain about the stipend for board members, but it's also at the same time, it's a little bit hard for me to ask for more because I'm sensitive to the fact that there are other, very worthy needs out there. And obviously we're able to do the work that we've been doing or we wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, that's a very complicated, believe it or not, that whole notion of board payment, because all the other boards and what they get in this, and every year we hear from GovOps, so we're gonna take the companies to look at this, but it seems to be the next year. One of these years we'll seriously get to that.
Senator Williams, thank you for letting me jump in on that.
No, but that's Senator Weeks is next.
Oh, okay.
That's what it was.
Yeah, just a curiosity. So there's a tension around the State Board of Education. We're relatively new into this neck of the woods, but it's pretty obvious. I'm wondering, it's not on your list of asks, but it's on the final page of the briefing. Why don't you ask the legislature for clarity on the governance structure and your role in that governance structure? Because we're right in the middle of that conversation. And I think it's germane to have an answer so that everyone feels that their efforts are valued and you're relevant and you're participating in the conversation, but that would be request number one. Where do we fit in and what's big? Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
And that's a good point. And I personally don't have an answer to that question. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I think it is a conversation that needs to be had. And I think as we're thinking about education in Vermont and restructuring everything, I think, the State Board of Ed, the Agency of Ed, that's part of that conversation.
To here than here.
So annual, do you submit budget annually? Who do you submit it to?
We have met with the governor's office, as well as Secretary Saunders in terms of, starting with FY25 where we were looking for additional monies. So they're both aware. I would say it's fair to say that they're supportive, but I've seen no movement on, our $70,708 budget. And we started these conversations, I want to say in August.
And had the same conversations last year as well.
So you don't have any indication if you're in the governor's budget?
No.
Okay,
No.
I'm sorry.
And if we are, it's buried within the agency budget.
Thank you. I'm wondering, I'm trying to think creatively about ways to get you the things that you need that may not cost more money. I don't know if that's fantasy, but so when I'm looking at the 25 grand for legal counsel for the CTE rules, does the agency ever provide you with proposed rules that comes from their counsel and they say, here's a potential starting place, and our counsel reviewed it? I mean, I know there could be a conflict as you described. There's both entities are filling different roles, but does anything like that ever happen? Is there that sort of cooperation?
That is the plan with the CTE rules. So we are awaiting a draft from the agency, which will have been reviewed by agency counsel before it comes to the board, before the board then engages in the formal rulemaking process. And to your point, it very well may be less than $50,000 by the time, because we will have gotten a version of the rules that has already, received the benefit of legal review before it comes to us.
But changes could be made.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And based on and I can talk about this in the context of the EQS, based on that experience, right? We took in a ton of public comment, right? That really helped think. The agencies, I'm sure, are going to provide us an excellent draft, right? That is gone through their council and reflects sort of their policy positions on this. But then our job as, again, the public and public education is to take public comment, to consider what they've done and ask the question about implementability, right? To the extent to which it lines up with other rules, to the extent it lines up with statute, things along those lines. So that's a great starting point, as it was with the Act One working group provided us a draft for the EQS. But I think it's fair to say that there will be additional changes to that, and we will take in additional public comment and feedback on that. And in the context of doing the EQS, having legal counsel help us sift and sort through some of that was very helpful, right? Because some of the comments that we get, on the face, they might make sense, but they fly in the face of other kinds of statutory provisions. For example, discrimination, right? And the challenge of how do we think about discrimination in the context of federal law and state law, right? Those are really hard things, and that's going to be, in this case, part of the update to the CTE rules.
So before we move on to EQS, I just want to make sure whether anyone has any other questions. And Will, I might need your help to pull up the other.
I mean, while you're pulling that up, I'm just trying to process this because, I mean, we spend more on like a consultant for a small question in education. There's just so much money in the system. Are like,
Do you have it up?
I think this was kind of asked, but I'm just trying to understand, do we need to ask the secretary,
Yeah.
like, what is happening and how to put you into the governance recommendation and just make this budget make sense.
I might ask a question back.
Yeah.
Right, and I wear a hat as a chair, a vice chair, but I also do education policy work in lots of places, and so I wear that hat on Monday, right? And oftentimes I'll ask questions back, and the question I'll ask back to you is, after 2012, when there was this divorce
Yeah.
right, between, does it make sense for the State Board of Education's budget to still be embedded with within the agency, or should that be a line item appropriation? That's a policy decision that you all would need to make, but I'll put that question back out to you.
And where is it now, to be clear?
It is embedded within the agency's budget.
So
So to your question, right, like, I'm answering your question, and I'm doing
Yeah.
that in a very objective way,
Yeah.
right? Like, but I think
I am
there
also
are,
asking that question.
I think that's also
Right.
another way
Yeah.
to think about this. Is
Yeah.
where is the appropriate location
Right.
for the appropriation for the State Board of Education, right? Because I'm noticing that it's surprising to many of you,
Yeah.
right? And so if that's surprising to you and that's something of interest to you, then it seems like a relevant question for this body to be asking.
So onto the
Yeah.
World Series 2000.
Changing gears. So we just talked a little bit about this role of State Board. And again, one of our primary responsibilities is with respect to the rules. And one of the most important rule series that we have for the education quality standards are Rule 2000. I'm going to use EQS for short. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that process because I think it's really important that we all understand what has transpired. So the purpose of the EQS and its amendments is that the EQS effectively establishes the standards that public schools need to meet to ensure that all Vermonters have educational opportunities that are substantially equal. And prior to this last update, they were last updated in 2014. And this most recent update, the EQS, was initiated in response to Act 1. And we had the Act 1 working group that spent a great deal of time reflecting on the educational quality standards and sort of its role, right, that body role, its role in terms of social equity and social justice. And they came to us with a set of recommendations for how that role should be updated. And that was what instigated this most recent update to the rules. Changes as a result of Act 1 that we needed to consider in our rulemaking were, again, Act 1 asks us to consider how the rule would make sure that we increase cultural competency of students, increased attention to the history, contribution, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups, promote critical thinking regarding history, contributions, and
We're not seeing
perspectives.
what you're
Yeah, I was gonna say,
saying.
hit open PowerPoint.
Oh, gosh.
Oh. It says I'm screen sharing.
The blue, maybe, open PowerPoint.
I don't know.
I think that you need to,
Or start slideshow.
But I'm not seeing it on my computer.
Oh, yes.
so you missed the last step on these slides.
Please stop sharing for a second. See, do you mind if I?
When I think it's hard
How
because
many
this
of
is
you
my personal
have
computer and not a
have
state.
heard from your constituents
Yeah.
about the EQS? You have, what have you heard from them?
Well, I'll back off because it's like superintendents,
Okay,
you know, for the majority,
Okay.
principals.
okay, just, I'm always curious what you're hearing in the field about this, and thought I'd ask while I was with the PowerPoint.
Okay, there you go. You
Okay.
We might want to back up.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank
How
you
about we
very much.
back up and we'll start over? So again, the purpose of the EQS, right, is to establish the operating framework for public schools in this state, right? And that operating framework is really focused on ensuring that we meet curricular standards that are set over here in these standards, right? But also that we ensure substantially equal educational opportunities for all public school students. The EQS was last updated in 2014. And the amendments most recently were largely driven by Act 1. Next slide. Act One asked us to consider like 6 things. One, we needed to update the rule to ensure that we had a framework that was going to increase the cultural competency of students in grades PK-12, that we would increase attention to the history, contribution, and perspective of ethnic and social groups.
Can I ask
Yes, please.
a clarifying question? What's cultural competency?
Cultural competency is how we understand our relationships with others who kind of have different cultural backgrounds. And the competency, sort of the core competency with that is when we think competency, we talk about what students know and can do. It's their ability to interact with other and appreciate other people, other individuals' backgrounds.
Good, thank you.
Third, promote critical thinking regarding the history, contributions, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups. 4, commit supervisory unions to eradicating racial bias in their curriculum. 5, provide across their curricula content and methods that enable students to safely explore questions of identity, race, equality, and racism. And 6, ensure that the basic curriculum and extracurricular programs are welcoming to all students. That's what Act 1 gave us in terms of the framework. So what did we do? Well, we took that framework, but we also then took the opportunity to look at the rules more holistically, right? Remember, they hadn't been updated since 2014. We've seen a lot of changes in public education. So we took the Act 1 recommendations in that framework. We talked, as I said, we had 42 committee meetings subcommittee meetings where we took input. We had 3 public hearings. And what we did is we stepped back and that led us to 5 buckets of sort of things that we did. 1, we ensured that the EQS was consistent with existing statute, right? We looked at it from that lens. 2, we asked ourselves, is the EQS understandable and able to be implemented in the field, right? And that's the core, I think that's a core value we have on the state board right now, is making sure whatever rules are implementable. We then took in technical changes that were recommended by the agency and the field to bring the document current with public policy and practice. We then had to align it with these new district quality standards, which Chair Samuelson mentioned a few minutes ago, which actually the agency developed separate from ours. We need to make sure those things work together. And then we considered input from the field and public about the rules impact on educational programs and practices. So we did those 5 things in addition to considering all the recommendations that came in for how to update the rules in the context of the Act 1 statute. We started this process in April 2022 when we received from the Act 1 Working Group recommendations for the EQS, and we concluded this process with a vote by LCAR on June 13th, 2024. This is a bit atypical in terms of the length of time, but what I will say is this rule is so substantial and the changes needed to be very thoughtful and careful, and we needed good counsel, right? These are the, right? Think about the topics that we're dealing with. They had to be done very carefully. And so we took our time, and I'm very proud of this rule. This is an excellent rule. It's not a perfect rule, right? There's no such thing as a perfect rule, and I'm sure that we will get good feedback on that. But this is a little longer period of time. So what this rule then did is it provided a platform for updating the 2200 series for independent schools, right? And it'll provide the platform that we'll use for updating the CTE rules. Because that same operating framework, it should never be the case that a child goes across the hallway in a high school and you have 2 separate standards, right? Or 2 separate set of expectations. And it should not be the case, especially with the principles we put up here, that it should be the case that a child who goes to an independent school should have a different experience than a child who goes from a public school. And so we spent a lot of time in the EQS trying to get that framework right. And then we lifted and shifted to the extent we could within the boundaries of existing statute to have the same framework apply to independent schools. And that again will serve as a foundation for how we approach the CTE rules. I want to acknowledge that this work was done by this committee, certainly the full state board, but Kim Gleason, who's not here today, I'm sure many of you know Kim, co-chaired this and was an incredible leader for this work. We have Mohammed Diab from Winooski School District, Greg Ray Farron, who's our student member from Vergennes, Rich Warner from Dover, and we had former members. This committee went along for a while. We had Patrick Brown from Burlington, Tom Levitt, the former head of from St. Johnsbury Academy, and Gabrielle Lucci, who's a student member. So for that 2 years period of time, this is the group of people who worked on this and then made those recommendations back to the board. So next steps. In addition to implementing the rule, remember I talked about a little earlier, we have rulemaking authority, we also have standards, right? We have to deal with in our job, in our roles. And we have a second follow-on piece now, right? Which is the Act One Working Group has proposed to us the Vermont State Ethnic Studies Framework, or the IRIS framework. Those would be the curricular standards that implement the social equity, the ethnic studies component of the EQS, which is new. We took in that first draft of the standards in June 2023, but it's difficult to implement or sort of process standards for a rule that hasn't been passed yet, right? That rule wasn't approved. So we've considered them, and then they were presented to us again in fall 2023. And as of this fall now, since the EQS is going into effect in July, the rule was approved on June 13th of 2024. We could then start to consider these. And the goal is to have those standards up and running in time for school districts by July 1st of 2025, when the rule goes into effect. So we're not quite done with the entire process, but I will also point out that the EQS has lots of speaks to lots of other types of curricula, math, science. We already have standards for that curriculum. Because the ethnic studies component of the EQS was new, we now need to have curricular standards around those. And in this package are two resources. One is a link to the current final adopted rule, and the other one is a link to the standards.
Wait, this one on page.
Yeah, I think actually this morning when you emailed me, I got 2 copies of the other presentation. So if you could actually just email me this one, and then it'll be right up afterwards. Sure. Yeah.
Should I stop sharing my screen? Or do you want me to leave this up?
So again, new to education committee, but I helped write the diversity curriculum for UVM back in the day, a long time ago now. And we paid a lot of attention to classroom pedagogy because, and we experience this maybe today in our DEI training, but this can be a very isolating and exposing time for students who might feel more like the subject than a fellow student. I also had a request in to hear about what happened in Morrisville, which I don't know, if that rises to the level of you having an interest or looking into that. But, it can be really hard to teach these subjects while there's conflict, or bullying happening at the same time. So I don't know what my question is. I guess I'm worried. I'm a little worried about this. We worried a lot at UVM when this was implemented. And
I think there are a lot of people in the field, I wouldn't say worried, but they're paying attention.
Yeah. I suppose that I also had contracts to help implement this work.
Yeah, and I think, the state board's job was to create the framework. The state board's second job is going to be create the standards, and the standards are what we expect students to know and be able to do. But the curriculum job and the pedagogy, right, and providing the leadership around the climate around that, the leadership is going to need to come from the agency, right? Because they're the implementing body. Yeah. But also that's a top down, but we also need that from the bottom up, and that's a lot of professional development. Right. This is not, if we look nationally, this is changes, significant changes in practice are required, right? Significant changes in climate are required for these standards to be implemented in the intent to meet the intent of Act One.
Yeah. So I guess it is just going back to being able to hear more and talk to our equity practitioners in the schools.
That's right.
who, if they have an equity practitioner, are probably doing a little better than the districts that don't even have one. So is that gonna be like a new requirement? A lot of those districts are losing or dissolving those positions. I don't know. I have
What I
concerns.
can say is in the EQS, one of the
Mhm.
things we did do, we're able to do is, we do have new reporting requirements for districts that require different kinds of disaggregation of data. And, data-informed decision-making is really helpful, I think. It doesn't get to some of the nuances and the climate in the classroom, right? But I will say that, I think the legislature and policymakers and citizens now will have access to data that are more nuanced, that can help to understand some of these things. It's also going to be part of requirements around what districts have to report every year and talk about in their reporting every year. I think that's right from our position, what we can do on the state board. Those are the kinds of policy levers we can pull.
Yeah.
I think the legislature pulled a major policy lever with Act One, right? But I think the next phase now is with respect to implementation. And that's hard. And that's going to take time.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much for coming up. I don't know how far you travel, but I know how far you travel. So, thank you for making the effort. Really helpful and informative.
Yeah.
And we may end up asking you back before we're done.
All right. Thank you all.
But it really was helpful. Thank you.
Can I, it doesn't have to be live. I don't know. Should it be live?
Well, we're still on.
No, we're
so-
still live, so I'm gonna say, I have nothing to hide. I wonder, I mean, with appropriations, people have someone to talk to and to like flesh out their budget request. I just feel like you could use some support to understand our process and how to make this request. I would volunteer to help you with that. I don't know, like, you're doing great, but with a budget of $70,000, like, I think we could do some work outside of committee to help you be prepared to navigate the session.
I appreciate that because I can identify a need, but I will be the first to admit, I don't really understand, the breadcrumbs to follow from identifying the need to actually receiving the help that I think we need. So it's been a little bit of a, I feel like I'm sort of searching in the dark because I'm not really sure, what I'm asking for, how to ask for it, how to package it in a way that's going to be familiar to the people who are in charge with making this decision. So, I mean, you taking notes.
And yeah, if you're gonna do that, great.
That's my
I just
speed.
don't want you to disappear and come back in a few months and.
But yeah, thank you.
Good, okay, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
So-
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So we are going to adjourn until, tomorrow at
Tomorrow at
1:30.
yes.
Here